It started with a letter, folded neatly in thirds, typed in clean, legal font, and delivered to the office of the county clerk on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. No one noticed it at first. The woman at the front desk even set her coffee on top of it without realizing. But once it was read, the silence that followed spread fast. The letter was a formal petition, a lawsuit brought by an outside legal advocacy group demanding the immediate removal of the Virgin Mary statue that had stood on the lawn of Oak Valley Courthouse for 67 years. Their argument was simple. The statue, placed on government property, violated the separation of church and state. The town's reaction was anything but simple. Oak Valley wasn't a place that made the news. Population: 412. One blinking traffic light, 3 churches, one bar, and a diner that hadn't changed the menu since 1985. The courthouse stood at the center of it all, brick, faded, with white columns that chipped a little more each winter. And on the left side of the steps, shaded by an old elm, stood the statue. 4 feet tall, carved from pale stone, arms open, head bowed. Her face, weathered but gentle, seemed to soften the entire building. No one remembered a time she hadn't been there. Children used to leave dandelions at her feet. Newlyweds posed for pictures beside her. War veterans tipped their hats walking past. No one asked for a statue, but no one ever wanted it gone either, until now. By the end of the week, the diner buzzed with murmurs that never quite turned into shouting. "It's just a piece of stone," said Carl Mason, a man who hadn't been to church in 20 years. "Why risk a lawsuit?" But across from him, Ruth Kelly clutched her coffee cup a little tighter. "That statue saved this town once," she said. "We made a promise." She didn't elaborate. She never did. But people listened. They always had. The town split, not in half, but into thirds. There were those who wanted to fight, who showed up at the courthouse with candles and flowers, who started prayers at dusk that stretched into night. Then there were those who welcomed the challenge, a chance to update, to modernize, to make Oak Valley into something new. And then there were the quiet ones, the in-betweeners, the ones who weren't sure what they believed, but who found themselves slowing down when passing the statue, looking up at her face, feeling something they didn't have a word for. The court docket set a date. A federal judge would be assigned. News vans showed up from Lexington. A camera crew from Louisville filmed B-roll of the statue under morning mist. And the people of Oak Valley watched the woman on the lawn, some with hope, some with dread, and some with the growing, unshakable feeling that whatever was about to happen, this wouldn't be a normal case. It wasn't just a trial about stone. It was something else, and it had already begun. Long before courtrooms and lawsuits, before news vans and legal filings, there was only a field and a scream that split the summer air. The year was 1956. Oak Valley was smaller, then barely more than a cluster of homes, a feed store, and the courthouse that doubled as town hall. The days were hot, the roads dusty, and most people knew everyone else's middle name. That July, a little girl named Clara Jennings wandered into traffic chasing her puppy. A delivery truck crested the hill too fast. There wasn't time to stop. And yet, somehow, it did. Witnesses, if you asked them then, if you asked them now, said the truck's tires locked, screeched, and slid. But the strangest part was what they said came next. The truck didn't hit Clara. It stopped inches from her dead still, engine choking out as if the air itself had frozen solid. The girl stood in the center of the road, untouched, wide-eyed, clutching the squirming puppy in her arms. The driver, shaking, climbed down and knelt right there on the hot pavement. "It wasn't me," he said. Something stopped it. Her mother, running from the porch, scooped her up in disbelief. But she didn't cry. Not Clara. She just looked up at the elm tree by the courthouse and said, "The lady told me I'd be okay." At first, people thought she meant her mother or a kind passerby. But Clara shook her head. "No," she said, "the lady in the light." She was standing by the tree. There was no one there, of course, nothing but summer heat and a growing crowd. Still, the story spread. The town didn't talk much about miracles back then. They believed in hard work, discipline, and Sunday service. But something shifted that day. Quietly, without committee or fundraising campaign, the people decided a statue should go there. A tribute. A thank you. Not to the girl or her family, but to something older, something unseen. They didn't say the word miracle out loud. They just nodded to each other and started building. A local mason, James Jimmy Devereaux, offered to carve it himself. He'd never sculpted before, but no one questioned him. He worked nights in the garage behind his house, windows covered in newspaper. Weeks passed, then months. Until one morning, he wheeled the finished piece onto the courthouse lawn on a dolly flanked by two of his brothers. No unveiling, no ceremony, just a sheet pulled back, revealing a figure in flowing robes, palms out, gaze lowered, face soft as dusk. The people who saw it first didn't speak for a long time. They placed her at the edge of the courthouse steps, exactly where Clara said she'd seen the lady in the light. Over time, flowers appeared at her feet. People left notes. Someone installed a small lantern that flickered every night, even when no one lit it. There was no plaque, no dedication, just the statue, watching over Oak Valley. And for nearly 70 years, no one ever thought to move her. Until now. Over the years, the statue became more than just stone. It became habit, then tradition, then something deeper, something like presence. People passed her every day without thinking and yet always noticed her. The mailman touched the brim of his cap when stepping onto the courthouse steps. Teenagers on their way to detention slowed down, even if just for a second. And every Easter morning, someone no one knew who left a single white lily at her feet before sunrise. No one claimed credit. No one had to. Everyone knew she'd be there. And somehow, everyone knew she was watching. There was never a fence around her. No sign saying, "Do not touch." Children ran small fingers along the folds of her robe. Couples posed beside her after courthouse weddings. Grieving families paused before stepping inside for probate hearings or custody disputes. Veterans returning from overseas stopped to stand with her for a moment before continuing home. She wasn't an icon. Not in the religious sense, not to everyone. But she was something, a constant, a quiet shape in the middle of a town that had seen its fair share of change. Factories had closed, families had moved, but the lady on the lawn never left. When Clara Jennings died at 61, after a long fight with cancer, they buried her in Oak Valley Cemetery, facing east toward the rising sun. But what most people remembered from her funeral was what her daughter whispered through tears at the reception. She still believed the lady saved her. Every day of her life. And when the courthouse's wooden door frames were finally replaced with steel, the old hinges were melted down and reshaped into a small candle holder that still sits behind the statue, barely visible, but always burning. Tourists didn't come to Oak Valley. There were no signs on the interstate pointing to the courthouse. No brochures. The statue was never meant for outsiders. But for the people who lived there, who'd been raised within sight of that lawn, she was personal, quietly sacred. Like a family heirloom left on display for all to see, but only fully understood by those who had grown up with her shadow on their shoulders. That's why the letter hit like it did. Not because it challenged religion, many in Oak Valley weren't churchgoers. Not because it came from outsiders had come and gone before. But because it treated her like an object, something you could measure, label, relocate, or worse, destroy. It didn't matter what the lawyers said about constitutionality or precedent. To the people of Oak Valley, the statue was no more removable than the roots under their town. And so, as court filings began to flow, as reporters circled, as legal teams prepared their arguments, the people began doing what they always had: lighting candles, leaving flowers, whispering prayers, not loudly, not as protest, but as preservation. Because faith in Oak Valley didn't need a spotlight. It only needed a lawn. And the statue standing on it, Judge Malcolm Reyes had presided over family court, small claims, and civil disputes for nearly 2 decades. He was known for 2 things: precision and silence. His rulings were never delayed. His opinions were concise, always citing precedent, never wasting a sentence. He rarely raised his voice. In fact, some wondered if he ever smiled. In a town that liked its judges warm and familiar, Reyes stood out like a marble bust, stoic, unmoved. He didn't eat at the diner. He didn't attend church socials. He lived alone in a narrow red brick house just outside town, where his only visible hobby was tending to a perfectly square garden. The people respected him, but no one claimed to know him. When the case of Torres v. Oak Valley County landed on his docket, it wasn't assigned, it was selected. Some said the state chose him because he wouldn't flinch, wouldn't let sentiment sway the law. Others said he volunteered. No one could confirm either story. What was certain is that when the papers came across his desk, he read them once, folded them neatly, and set them down beside a cup of black coffee. Then he stared out his office window for a long time. The statue was visible from there, if you knew exactly where to look, just the top of her head above the hedge line. That morning, he stared until the coffee went cold. In the first hearing, Judge Reyes said nothing for the first 30 minutes. He let the attorney speak, let the town representative speak, even allowed 2 citizens, one from each side, to take the floor. He listened, eyes steady, hands folded. When the lawyer from the advocacy group argued that a religious symbol had no place on government grounds, Reyes nodded once, jotting something in his notebook. When the town's attorney responded with talk of heritage, history, and cultural memory, he made no expression at all. By the end of the session, he'd spoken only 12 words. Motion to proceed accepted. Arguments to resume next Thursday. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck once, clear and sharp, and he stood, already turning toward the chamber door. But as he passed the gallery, several people swore, though none would say it aloud until much later, that he glanced briefly through the courtroom window. Just for a second, just long enough to see the statue in the distance. Her stone gaze lowered, her arms open as ever. Reyes didn't share opinions in public, but he began walking to the courthouse each morning instead of driving. His route took him along the edge of the lawn. He never stopped, never paused, but always passed within a few feet of the statue. A few curious onlookers noticed him once. Early 6:45 a.m., standing still with one hand behind his back, his eyes not on her face, but on the ground beneath her. Looking down, as if trying to see what held her in place. As if he already knew this case wouldn't go the way anyone expected, not even him. By the second hearing, the courtroom was packed. Every pew creaked under the weight of neighbors who'd never before set foot inside that building unless it was to pay a parking ticket or renew a business license. The bailiff had to turn people away at the door. Those who couldn't get in stood outside, clustered under the windows with radios tuned to the local AM station broadcasting the proceedings. Inside, Judge Reyes presided with the same cool detachment as always, while the town, its stories, its fears, its faith sat quietly on trial. The plaintiff's attorney spoke first. Her voice was sharp, each sentence clipped and deliberate, like she'd practiced it in a mirror. She explained the history of the Establishment Clause, cited federal rulings, held up photographs of the statue taken at dusk, candlelight glowing at her feet, worshippers kneeling beneath her, and asked the court a question no one wanted to answer. Is this a neutral public space or a shrine sanctioned by the government? The defense followed. They didn't deny that people prayed. They didn't deny that the statue resembled the Virgin Mary. They didn't even deny that flowers, candles, and folded notes appeared at her base almost daily. But she wasn't commissioned by a church, said the town's attorney, a local named Frank Harrelson, sleeves rolled to the elbows. She was carved by a man in his garage. She was placed there by neighbors, not officials. And she wasn't meant to convert. She was meant to comfort. Outside, a teenager held a sign that read, "Don't move what never moved." Down the block, someone else held one that read, "Faith doesn't belong in front of the law." And in the middle between those clashing ideologies were the people of Oak Valley, many of whom didn't know which side they belonged to. The statue had always been there, before politics, before controversy. Before anyone thought to draw a line, testimony followed. A retired janitor spoke of watching veterans cry in front of the statue before going in for court hearings about benefits. A young mother said she once found her son, who never spoke, standing beside it, whispering to himself with tears in his eyes. A local teacher explained that he walked past it each day before class and nodded not as a prayer, but as a way to steady himself. She doesn't ask for belief, he said, she just listens. Then came the cross-examinations. The prosecutor questioned the town's motivations, implying that if it looked like worship and sounded like worship, maybe it was worship. But no one yelled. No one stormed out. Oak Valley didn't erupt. It absorbed, like an old tree in a windstorm, creaking, but not cracking. When court adjourned, Judge Reyes didn't linger. He stepped down from the bench, stone-faced as ever, and walked out the side door. But those who sat close swore they saw something strange just before he left. The judge had touched the bench's edge with 2 fingers, then brushed them briefly over his chest. It could have been dust, or it could have been the sign of the cross. She sat in the second row every Thursday, legs swinging just above the floor, pink sneakers tapping against the wooden bench. Her name was Lila, 8 years old, big eyes, soft voice. She came with her grandmother, who always wore the same blue cardigan and clutched a set of rosary beads so old the silver had worn to gray. Lila didn't understand all the legal words, didn't follow the back and forth of attorneys arguing about precedent in public land, but she understood the tone. She could feel tension in the room, and she knew one thing for certain. They wanted to take the lady away. To Lila, the statue wasn't some abstract symbol. It was her friend. The first time she ever noticed, it was the same week she was fitted for her wheelchair. Spinal muscular atrophy. Words too big for a child to pronounce. But she remembered the fear, the way the hospital room smelled, and how the hallway lights buzzed louder when she cried. When they brought her home, her grandmother wheeled her past the courthouse one morning and Lila had looked up and seen her. The lady, pale, still, kind. She didn't know the name Mary, but she knew the warmth in her chest when she saw that face. "She's like me," she'd whispered that day. "She just stands still and watches." From then on, every walk into town included a stop at the statue. Sometimes they left daisies, sometimes just a whisper. Lila talked to her the way some children talk to dolls or imaginary friends. She told her about school, about how the boys were loud, and the girls sometimes whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. She told her when her legs hurt, she told her when they didn't. She always finished with the same sentence: "Please don't leave." Now, in the courtroom, her small voice cut through the quiet. It wasn't during testimony. It wasn't planned. It came in the middle of a lawyer's argument about legal liabilities and municipal obligations. Lila leaned toward her grandmother and asked, just loud enough for the nearby rows to hear, "If they take her away, where will I talk to her?" The room shifted. People stirred. Even the judge looked up for a moment. The lawyer paused, hesitated, then continued, but the words felt thinner, less certain. The transcript wouldn't record that question. No reporter would quote it. But everyone who heard it would remember it. Because it wasn't political. It wasn't legal. It was a question from a child who didn't understand separation of church and state, but who understood separation. Who knew what it felt like to lose something? That evening, someone left a crayon drawing at the base of the statue. It showed a little girl in a wheelchair, sitting beside a tall lady in white robes. No words. Just the two of them, side by side. And though no one claimed the drawing, it stayed there for days, protected under a sheet of plastic as the rain began to fall. It began on the fourth day of hearings, just after the bailiff called the court to order and before either attorney had spoken. A faint click, a hum, then a blink, just enough to cause the overhead lights to dim for half a second. Most people didn't even register it. Some glanced upward. A few exchanged looks. Then everything returned to normal. But it happened again and again, always when the statue was mentioned. At first, it was written off as old wiring. The courthouse had been built in 1911 and updated haphazardly over the years. No one was surprised by the occasional flicker, but this was different. The lights didn't falter during long-winded motions or heated objections. They flickered only when someone referred to the statue by name or description. The Virgin Mary, the monument, the figure on the lawn. Each time, the bulbs above dimmed just enough to notice, like a breath being held. The court's maintenance man, a heavy-set veteran named Donnie Kravitz, was sent up into the rafters to check the fixtures. He came back scratching his head. "Everything's solid," he said. "Wiring's clean. No surge, no shorts." When someone suggested maybe the power grid was to blame, Donnie grunted and muttered, "Funny how it only happens when they talk about her." By the sixth flicker, the courtroom had grown quieter. Tension didn't rise, it settled. Thick in the air like dust. People began sitting straighter, listening more closely. And though no one dared say it aloud, a question hovered in the silence. Was something listening too? That Friday, the court clerk Lena Porter, known for her neat handwriting and unshakable calm, typed up a summary of the day's minutes. She paused when writing the words, "Mention of the statue." As she typed them, her desk lamp dimmed. Just hers. Not the ceiling light, not the hallway fluorescence. Just the lamp on her desk. She reached forward to tighten the bulb, then stopped. The power cord was unplugged. Completely. She hadn't noticed until her hand brushed over empty air. At home that night, she left her notebook closed. Instead, she sat in silence, replaying the moment in her mind. She didn't tell anyone. Not then. But the next morning, she placed a small white candle on the courthouse steps. No note, no message, just the candle. And like others before it, it burned without flickering. The following week, news spread that one of the courtroom cameras had glitched. A reporter from the local affiliate played back footage and noticed 3 seconds missing from the feed. Not black screen. Not static. Just absence. Like time itself had skipped. The timestamp jumped. And when they reviewed the content leading up to it, the moment was clear. It had occurred precisely when a witness spoke the words, "She shouldn't be touched." Whether it was power surge, coincidence, or something stranger, the effect on the courtroom was undeniable. The lights kept flickering, and the people, whether they believed or not, started to feel watched. Or perhaps warned. Every town has someone who remembers more than they say. In Oak Valley, that person was Ruth Kelly, 84 years old, widow, church organist for nearly half a century. People said she could play hymns from memory even after her eyesight began to fade. She'd lived in the same yellow house since 1953 and walked to the courthouse every Friday morning with a bouquet of lilies and a single white candle. Always the same routine, always the same pace. Even when her arthritis flared, even when snow dusted the ground, even when no one else dared to walk that early, Ruth showed up, and the candle always burned. It had started, quietly, years ago after her husband, Harold, passed. She never said much about the grief. Just that silence filled the house too thickly, and that the lady on the lawn was the only one who seemed to understand. The first candle she brought was small, no taller than a thumb, and she tucked it behind the statue's base. When it burned until dawn, untouched by wind or rain, Ruth took it as a sign. Not a miracle, exactly, but a kindness. A gesture that someone, somewhere, still heard her. So she kept bringing them. Every Friday, before the courthouse opened, Ruth lit a candle, left her lilies, and whispered a single prayer. Keep watch. We forget so easily. She never told anyone the words. They were hers alone. But more than a few people noticed the candles, especially in the weeks after the lawsuit was filed. Because now, they didn't just burn, they glowed. Not flickering, not wavering. Solid, steady, as though held still by an invisible hand. On the Monday after the seventh hearing, as protest signs multiplied and the courtroom line stretched around the block, Ruth made her way up the courthouse steps earlier than usual. The sun was barely touching the horizon. Her breath came in short, slow puffs, and she leaned heavier than usual on her cane. But she walked the path like a pilgrim, like someone retracing a vow. At the statue's base, she knelt, though her knees ached in protest, and placed her candle in the shallow groove worn into the stone. This time, she didn't light it. She waited. She sat in silence for several minutes, her gloved fingers gently curled around the unlit wick. Then, just as the first light of day spilled across the lawn, the flame caught on its own. A thin, golden tongue of fire, rising from untouched wax. Ruth didn't react. She only nodded. Once, then stood and walked away. By noon, word had spread. A clerk said she saw the flame before Ruth touched a match. A delivery driver swore he'd watched it appear from the window of his truck. And that evening, someone placed 5 more candles beside it. The next day, there were 12. No one called it a miracle, not yet. But from then on, the phrase began to circulate, passed from whisper to whisper, pew to pew, courtroom to diner. The lady isn't alone, and she's not done watching. The judgment came on a cloudless Thursday. Courtroom full, air still, not a breath of wind through the open transom windows. Judge Reyes entered precisely at 9:00 a.m., his black robes fluttering slightly as he passed the bench. The attorneys stood. The audience held its collective breath. For weeks, speculation had circled he was going to delay, to punt it to a higher court, to recuse himself quietly. But as he took his seat, his expression gave nothing away. And in a voice, as even as always, he read the decision. The petition to remove the statue located on the Oak Valley Courthouse lawn is hereby granted. The statue shall be removed from public grounds and placed into storage or destroyed, as determined by the county board, within 48 hours of this order. No raised voices. No wails of protest. Just a sharp inhale from the second row, Lila's grandmother, and the sound of a pencil snapping in half. The words hung heavy, as if the judge had read a sentence over the entire town, not just the statue. Reyes looked up, scanning the room. His eyes didn't linger on the lawyers or the court reporter. They settled on the empty space near the window where the statue's head was just barely visible through the glass. He didn't speak again. He simply nodded to the bailiff, and the room slowly began to stir. Outside, the courthouse lawn was already half surrounded by camera crews. Tripods, boom mics, journalists with practiced tones and perfect hair. They'd come to witness history. The removal of a religious symbol. The moment a town took its next step into the modern world, or, depending on who you asked, its first real stumble. By evening, the county issued a statement. The statue would be removed Saturday morning. A demolition crew from out of town had been contracted. The removal would be live-streamed from courthouse security cameras and made publicly available for legal transparency. They didn't say the word destroyed, but it was implied. That night, the town didn't sleep. Oak Valley moved like something holding its breath. Porch lights stayed on. Families sat at kitchen tables in silence. At Tony's diner, a waitress accidentally poured black coffee over orange juice and never noticed. And at the foot of the statue, candles multiplied. They ringed her feet like a crown of light. More than 50 now, flickering against the night. Someone laid down a rosary. Someone else left a baseball cap, a child's drawing, a letter folded tight enough to hide its words. Judge Reyes didn't go home. Not right away. Instead, he remained in his chambers long after the building emptied. At one point, the janitor said he saw the judge standing in front of the window, hand against the glass, watching the flickering flames below. Not moving, not blinking, just watching. And when the clock struck 3:33 a.m., the janitor swore he heard something deep and low, like a church bell tolling not outside but inside the walls. 3 times. Then silence. Saturday morning came with blue skies and the thick hum of anticipation. The news vans were back. More people had gathered than anyone expected, hundreds by some estimates, though no one was counting. They came quietly, some with lawn chairs, others with arms folded tight against their chest. No protest signs, no chants, just presence. As if by standing there, they could slow time. As if the statue might somehow stay, if enough people simply watched. The crew arrived just after 8:00 a.m., a flatbed truck, a rust-red crane, 6 men in orange vests. They looked like men used to getting jobs done without questions. The kind of men who could tear out a sidewalk, lift a generator, or dismantle a flagpole without blinking. The town didn't recognize them. That was by design. The county had contracted a company from 3 hours away, thinking distance might dull the sting. But distance does nothing to faith. And the moment the crew stepped out of the truck and saw the circle of candles, the flowers, the faces, they hesitated. The foreman, a man named Hank Dalton, squinted up at the statue and swore under his breath. He approached the courthouse steps with purpose, clipboard in hand, but as he got closer, his pace slowed. Ruth Kelly was already there, seated in her folding chair, her cane resting against her leg. She didn't say a word, just watched him the way only someone in their 80s can steady, knowing, unimpressed. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move back," he said. Ruth didn't move. She looked up at the statue, then back at him. "You're not the first," she said, "and you won't be the last." That's when it started. The first crane operator, a tall man with a long scar down his neck, climbed into the cab and tried to start the engine. Nothing. Not even a click. He popped the hood, grumbled, tried again. Still nothing. The foreman waved over another worker to check the wiring. The second man crouched, fiddled with cables, and stood up shaking his head. Batteries new, no reason it shouldn't turn over. The foreman swore again, louder this time, and reached for his phone to call dispatch. But the screen stayed black, no signal. All 6 phones on site were suddenly dead. Then came the wind. Out of nowhere, a sharp gust swept across the lawn. Papers flew. A hard hat rolled down the courthouse steps. The crane's boom arm swayed, groaning against the weight of stillness. The men exchanged glances. One of them, younger, stepped forward with a crowbar, intending to start breaking apart the foundation manually. But after a few feet, he froze. Later, when asked, he couldn't explain why. "I just felt something," he said, "like I was being watched, but not by people." That was when the foreman made his call. Not to his boss, not to dispatch. He turned to his crew and muttered, "Pack it up." And without ceremony, without excuse, the contractor refused. Just like that. No drills touched the stone. No cables were laid. The men climbed back into their trucks, turned the key, and this time, the engines started without a problem. The live feed was supposed to make everything easier. That's what the county said when they installed the extra camera on the southeast corner of the courthouse roof. Transparency, they called it. A neutral eye. It was meant to show the removal in real time, to reassure the public that nothing shady was being done behind closed doors. Just a simple relocation, filmed in daylight, streamed to a government-hosted web page no one had ever visited before. The camera, a standard 1080 model, had been installed by the town's usual tech guy, Marcus. It worked fine for 3 days straight, until it didn't. The morning the contractor backed out, the camera was already recording. Static at first, then a clean image, a wide shot of the courthouse lawn. You could see the statue clearly, flanked by flickering candles and surrounded by townsfolk in quiet standoff. The crane sat idle in the background. For the first 2 hours, everything appeared normal. Then at 10:47 a.m., something happened. The footage didn't cut to black. It didn't skip. It warped, like heat rising off pavement. The image bent and twisted, as if the lawn itself had turned to water. For exactly 9 seconds, the feed showed something strange, something no one could explain. A light, soft and round, hovered above the statue's head. Not lens flare, not sun glare, something else. And beside the light, a shadow. Not cast from the statue, but from the other side. A figure, barely formed, a blur of white, like robes in motion. Marcus reviewed the tape in silence, watching frame by frame. The moment the shadow appeared, every sensor in the courthouse tripped, motion detectors in empty hallways, security systems in locked offices. Then, the camera feed returned to normal. Crisp, clear, as if nothing had happened. The county IT team said it was data corruption, a one-time anomaly. They scrubbed the version posted to the website, citing compression issues. But not before a few hundred viewers caught the raw stream live and hit record. One of them was Ethan Keller, a journalist from a regional blog who'd been following the story for weeks. He published stills the same afternoon. Blurred, shaky, but unmistakable. Light above the statue and a ghost-like shape beside it. The article went viral within hours. Something stopped that crane and it was caught on camera. The county issued a takedown request. It was ignored. At the next town meeting, no one talked about the lawsuit. No one mentioned legal precedent or constitutional clauses. They just asked about the footage. One man stood and said what many were thinking. I don't know what I saw, but I know what I felt when I saw it, and it wasn't fear. In Judge Rhea's office, the footage played again. He watched it alone, slow and soundless, his finger hovering over the pause button. When the light appeared, he leaned closer. When the figure emerged, he didn't blink. And when it vanished, he sat back, folded his hands, and whispered something beneath his breath that no one would ever hear. But if you had been standing outside his window just then, you might have noticed. The flame of Ruth's candle had grown slightly taller. The courthouse clock struck noon with its usual hollow clunk, but something about the air felt different. The crowd gathered along the perimeter of the lawn had grown quiet, not out of respect, but anticipation. No new removal team had been announced, but the county hadn't canceled the order either. The statue still stood, pristine and untouched, her gaze lowered in calm defiance. The candles had multiplied again, nearly 100, now ringing her like stars around a moon. Flowers covered the grass, and handwritten notes were folded and tucked into the cracks in the stone base. The town was holding its breath. Then, it happened. A sound rolled across the square low, resonant, impossible. A bell. Not a chime or a clang, but a toll. One long, deliberate note that seemed to come from the sky itself. Everyone stopped. The hum of conversation died instantly. Some turned toward the church at the far end of Main Street, but its bell tower had been silent for years. Others looked up, confused. There was no bell on the courthouse grounds, no speaker system, nothing that could have made that sound. Then came the second toll. Deeper than the first, it hung in the air, vibrating the glass of the courthouse windows. A woman near the sidewalk dropped her coffee cup, the paper lid flopping into the gutter. Somewhere, a baby started crying. Most people stood frozen, unsure whether to pray or run, and then came the third. 3 tolls, slow, heavy, final. Afterward, there was no echo, just silence. Not even birds, not even wind. People looked at each other, eyes wide. Some began crossing themselves. Others whispered, "Did you hear it?" And, "Where did it come from?" But no one had answers. Only the feeling that something ancient had just spoken in a language they'd never known, but instantly understood. Ruth Kelly was there. She didn't look surprised. She simply nodded once and whispered the words she'd been saying for years. "We made a promise." Inside the courthouse, the lights flickered once, then steadied. Judge Reyes, seated at his desk, paused mid-sentence. The pen in his hand trembled slightly, leaving a dark blot on the margin of a legal pad. He looked toward the window, but didn't rise. He didn't need to. He knew what the sound meant. Down the street, a mechanic who hadn't been to church in decades stood beside an open hood and whispered a prayer he thought he'd forgotten. At the diner, Carla the waitress turned off the radio and stared out at the statue, a lump rising in her throat for reasons she couldn't name. And at the edge of the crowd, little Lila sat quietly in her wheelchair, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the statue's face. She didn't flinch. She smiled. That night, no one slept well. But not out of fear, out of wonder. The kind of wonder that comes when something breaks through the ordinary and leaves no room for doubt. 3 tolls. That's all it took. And everything was different. The footage wasn't supposed to exist. After the camera glitch during the previous week's failed removal attempt, the county had quietly stopped the live stream, citing equipment concerns. But Marcus, the courthouse tech, hadn't disabled the hard drive. Out of habit or maybe instinct, he'd set up a private backup system just in case something strange happened again. And something did. At exactly 12:40, 1 p.m., Seconds after the first bell toll, the backup camera picked up a shift on the lawn. No fanfare, no lightning, just movement. Slow, deliberate, and impossible. The demolition crew, another out-of-town team, had been standing in a loose semicircle, watching the crane operator adjust the hook. One of them, a man with a shaved head and reflective sunglasses, stepped forward with a sledgehammer slung over his shoulder. He was meant to chip away at the base, just enough to wedge in the lifting hooks. The plan was mechanical, cold, efficient. But as he approached the statue, the camera caught it. His pace slowed, his grip on the handle loosened. And then, at the precise moment he raised the hammer above his shoulder, the bell tolled a second time. The feed jittered. Not static, not blackout. A single frame, blurred, stretched wide as if reality had thinned. When the image cleared, the man had stopped mid-swing, completely still. Like someone had hit pause. His feet were rooted, his eyes wide, the hammer frozen in the air. For 7 full seconds, he didn't move. The rest of the crew noticed. One shouted, another reached out, but none of them crossed the invisible boundary between grass and statue. They hovered at the edge, unsure whether to intervene or flee. Then came the third toll. That's when the light appeared. The footage shows it clearly. A soft, pale glow blooming from the center of the statue's chest. It wasn't electric or flickering. It didn't cast shadows. It just was. A presence, impossible to explain and harder to ignore. The hammer in the man's hand dropped suddenly, hitting the ground with a flat thud. He stumbled backward, knees buckling, and sat down hard in the grass, staring at the statue like it had just spoken. It hadn't moved. Not an inch, not a twitch. But every person who watched that video said the same thing. It didn't need to. Marcus didn't post the footage online. Not right away. He took it to Judge Reyes first, on a flash drive sealed in a manila envelope. The judge watched it in silence. Once, then a second time. Then he closed the laptop, leaned back in his chair, and said nothing for nearly a minute. Finally, he asked, "Who else has seen this?" "Just me," Marcus replied. Reyes nodded. "Keep it that way. For now." But word leaked, as it always does. A still image hammer raised, man frozen found its way onto a local message board. From there it spread. And with it, a simple caption appeared, written in shaky script across the bottom. "You can't break what won't let you." The county denied everything. The crew refused to comment. But the town had already seen the truth, and the truth was watching back. He watched it alone. Not in chambers, not in the courtroom, but in the small, windowless records room on the courthouse's 3rd floor. A place where old files yellowed in steel cabinets and dust softened every sound. Judge Malcolm Reyes requested the original security footage from Marcus in person. No aides, no formality. He carried it himself, a flash drive no bigger than a matchstick, and locked the door behind him before pressing play. The video played on a dusty government-issued laptop, the kind that wheezed every time it loaded a new file. He watched from beginning to end, not touching the mouse, not blinking much. The first toll, the shift in air, the sledgehammer in mid-swing, the light, and finally the expression on the worker's face as he collapsed into the grass, not in pain, but in something close to awe. Reyes leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands folded over his mouth. He rewound the footage and played it again, this time slower, frame by frame. The blur in the air, the shimmer in the statue's center, the faint flicker of candlelight dancing in ways that didn't match the wind. He paused the video when the light was strongest and stared at it for a long time. His face didn't change. No widened eyes, no muttered words. But something in his posture shifted. A tiny exhale, almost inaudible. The sort of breath a man releases when the argument is over, and the verdict has arrived not from law, but from something higher. He reached into his coat pocket and removed something no one had seen him wear in years, a tiny silver cross on a chain. It had belonged to his mother, and after her passing, he kept it tucked away in a drawer, never worn, rarely touched. But now he held it in his hand, not reverently, but thoughtfully, as if weighing its meaning after all these years. For a man known for logic, for precision, for rulings that could cut granite, the look on Rhea's face in that moment was something else. Not surrender, not faith exactly, but humility. The kind that creeps in when reason fails, and silence offers more answers than words. He did not delete the file. He didn't copy it either. He closed the laptop, slid the flash drive back into the envelope, and placed it inside the breast pocket of his coat. Then he stood up and left the records room without a word. Later that afternoon, Marcus received a call. No voicemail, just a single line when he picked up. The file is secure. That's all you need to know. When the county commissioners met the following morning to discuss next steps, Judge Reyes declined to attend. When asked why, he simply replied, "The matter is no longer judicial." And when one commissioner pushed for clarity, Reyes looked him dead in the eye and said, "There's a difference between what's illegal and what's unwise." From that day on, no further attempts to remove the statue were scheduled. No statement was issued, no decision reversed. But everyone who had watched that footage, especially Judge Reyes, knew a judgment had already been made, and not by him. The county never announced a reversal. No press release, no meeting minutes, no news segment with headlines blaring "statue spared." But something shifted, quietly. Like a door that was once propped open slowly easing shut, the demolition crews didn't return. The equipment never came back. The contract was never completed, and the legal paperwork so meticulously tracked before simply stalled. The statute of compliance expired quietly in the clerk's office without anyone bothering to file for an extension. It was never called off, but it was never acted on either. In law, there's a word for this kind of silence: abeyance, a stay, a pause. Not quite a verdict, but not inaction either. It's the middle space where decisions sit when no one wants to push harder. That's where the statue lived now, not in victory, but in something more uncertain and far more powerful. She had not been defended by courts or protected by vote. She had been left alone. And in Oak Valley, that silence rang louder than any ruling ever could. Judge Reyes continued his work, but something in him had changed. He still wore the same crisp shirts, still showed up 5 minutes early to every session, still spoke in measured tones. But he no longer walked past the statue on his way to the courthouse. He rerouted deliberately, not out of avoidance, but respect. Like someone passing a grave they didn't feel worthy of looking at. Some days, he was seen glancing through his office blinds toward the lawn, holding a pen motionless above his desk, eyes distant. The townspeople noticed too. Though they never said the word miracle, their behavior began to change. The prayers returned, slow and steady. Candles kept burning, sometimes dozens at a time. The base of the statue was no longer just a spot for flowers. It became a living altar, decorated daily with offerings both sacred and ordinary: pine cones, bracelets, pressed leaves, even a hand-knit scarf. One morning, someone placed a pair of worn ballet slippers at her feet, with a note that simply read, "Thank you for letting her dance again." No one claimed ownership of the objects, but no one touched them either. Even the groundskeeper, who had always been diligent about keeping the lawn pristine, began mowing around them. He didn't explain. He just nodded once when asked and said, "She's earned her space." The legal group that had initiated the lawsuit sent a follow-up letter months later, inquiring about the status of removal. It was never answered. The letter was placed into a file folder and shelved. No one looked for it again. It was as if the town itself had agreed, not by vote, not by law, but by breath and stillness, that the matter had passed beyond the reach of government. And in that collective stillness, something holy bloomed. Not in fire, not in spectacle, but in the simple fact that the statue still stood, unmoved, undisturbed, as though the land itself had placed her there, and the people had finally caught up. It happened on a Sunday evening, during one of the candlelight vigils that had become almost instinct in Oak Valley. No flyers, no announcements, just people gathering. Some came with prayer cards, others with lawn chairs. Most came simply to sit in the hush. It was early October, and the air was cool enough for breath to fog in front of faces. The courthouse lawn was lit with soft halos from dozens of tiny flames, arranged in a careful ring around the Virgin's stone feet. And in the second row, as always, sat Lila. Her grandmother had wrapped a wool blanket around her lap. She looked up at the statue like she always did, with quiet adoration, not expecting answers, just comfort. People passed her and smiled gently, recognizing her without words. She had become part of the statue's story now, just as much as the lilies, the candles, and the quiet. Pastor Emmett had begun reading Psalm 121 in his low, gravelly voice. "I lift up my eyes to the hills, from where does my help come?" The crowd listened, murmuring amen under their breath. And then, in the middle of that silence, there was movement. Subtle at first. A slight shift in posture. A sound like a blanket slipping. Lila was standing. Not pushed. Not lifted. Not aided. She had stood. Her wheelchair sat just behind her, its lap belt unfastened. Her blanket crumpled on the seat. One hand clutched her grandmother's shoulder. The other was outstretched, reaching forward, not to the crowd, but to the statue. Her eyes were locked on the lady's face. The flames around her didn't flicker. The wind didn't stir. No one moved. Someone gasped. Then someone else whispered her name. Lila didn't say a word. She simply took one step forward. Just one. Enough for her feet to meet the grass. Her grandmother's hand trembled. She rose to support her, but Lila gently shook her head. Just for a second, she whispered. I wanted to say thank you. People wept openly. The kind of weeping that comes not from sadness, but from the overwhelming knowledge that something unexplainable is unfolding in front of you. That the world has opened a window just wide enough to let something divine slip through. A paramedic in the crowd instinctively stepped forward but stopped when Lila turned and smiled. I'm okay, she said. She's still here. No photos were taken. No one reached for a phone. Not because they were told not to, but because it didn't occur to them. The moment didn't want to be captured. It wanted to be held. Lila sat back down a moment later, her legs trembling from the effort, but her eyes glowing with something far beyond strength. Pastor Emmett never finished the psalm. He didn't have to. The rest of the verse hung in the night air, written without words. My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. And that night, every candle burned longer than usual. In the days after Lila stood, the town moved quietly. No newspapers picked up the story. No videos went viral, there were none to post. The people who'd been there didn't need proof. And the ones who hadn't? They didn't ask. Something sacred had unfolded in the open, and Oak Valley, in its own unspoken wisdom, decided not to exploit it. The diner buzzed, yes, but the tone had changed. Less speculation, more reverence. She stood, Carla would say, pouring coffee, eyes full. And that's all we needed to see. Even Lila didn't explain. When the local school principal stopped by her house the next day with flowers and wide, searching eyes, Lila just smiled and said, it wasn't about me. She returned to her wheelchair without fuss. Her grandmother said nothing had changed except that Lila now insisted on stopping by the statue each morning, even in the rain. At the courthouse, the statue remained untouched. The sledgehammer, still rusting beneath a nearby bush, was never retrieved. County maintenance crews quietly cleared fallen leaves and trimmed the hedges, but gave the base of the statue a wide berth. One man, new to town, asked why no one cleaned the stone directly. The others just looked at him. Eventually, he stopped asking. Judge Reyes returned to his routine, but something about him was different. He still handed down rulings with clarity, still quoted precedent, but the hard edge had dulled. He lingered more in court after proceedings, standing quietly by the window. He was seen once, just once, walking alone to the statue after hours, his coat collar up against the wind, a small bouquet of marigolds in his hand. He left them at her feet and walked away without speaking to a soul. The county made no further efforts to remove her. The advocacy group sent one final letter, cold and formal. It went unanswered. Eventually, they moved on to other cases. The world outside Oak Valley churned on, unaware that a small town in Kentucky had refused, in quiet defiance, to cut out its own heart. And yet, the miracle, if that's what it was, faded from conversation. Not from denial, but protection. Parents didn't tell their children what they'd seen. Friends didn't gossip. No plaques were installed. No slogans printed on t-shirts. Lila's step had become a shared secret, not because anyone feared ridicule, but because they knew some things were never meant for broadcast. Some things were meant to be kept. At the next town hall meeting, the statue wasn't on the agenda. Not even in new business. No one brought it up. But before the meeting adjourned, the mayor looked out over the small assembly and said, let's take a moment of silence tonight, just because. And everyone understood exactly what she meant. In Oak Valley, they stopped talking about what had happened that October. But every Friday, the candles still appeared. Every spring, the lilies returned. And every morning, if you stood very still on the courthouse lawn, you could feel it, that invisible presence, like breath on the back of your neck. Not fear, but memory. No one ever said the statue was staying. There was no headline, no ribbon cutting, no reversal filed in the court. And yet, there she stood, day after day, season after season, as if the land itself had anchored her in place, as if all the arguments, the lawsuits, the flashing cameras, and bureaucratic paperwork had never touched her. Only the people had, with their prayers, with their silence, with their candles and notes and small acts of reverence that said, without ever needing to be said, you belong here. By the following spring, the grass around her base had begun to grow thicker, more vivid. Volunteers, never named, never scheduled, began quietly tending the lawn around her. A local carpenter built a small wooden bench and placed it under the elm tree beside her. He didn't ask permission. No one objected. The courthouse janitor started bringing fresh water to the flower holders every Monday. An artist painted a portrait of her from memory and left it at the diner. "It's not for sale," she said. "It's a gift." The path that had once led demolition crews across the lawn faded with time. The tire marks disappeared. The tools rusted or were hauled off, but never replaced. The town no longer discussed moving her. Not because they forgot, but because they remembered everything. And they chose peace over proof, faith over force. Visitors began arriving not in busloads or with guidebooks, but in twos and threes. Word had spread, gently, through whispers and handwritten letters, that something had happened in Oak Valley. Something quiet and holy. They came with questions but left with stillness. Most didn't ask for stories. They simply stood at her feet, looked up at her soft, weathered face, and understood enough. Some lit candles, some knelt, some just stood, hands in pockets, eyes brimming with something they hadn't felt in years. Hope, maybe, or memory. Lila continued to visit every Sunday. Sometimes she stood, most days she didn't. That wasn't the point. The miracle had never been about walking. It had always been about being seen, being heard. And Lila, more than anyone, knew that the statue didn't promise healing. She promised presence. And that was more than enough. Judge Reyes retired that fall. Quietly. No press. No ceremony. His last official act was signing a blank line on a maintenance requisition form that allowed for minor improvements to historically significant items on courthouse grounds. That was the last piece of paper ever filed about the statue. Today, if you walk through Oak Valley, you'll find the lady right where she's always been. Arms open, gaze lowered, weathered but unbowed. She doesn't shimmer, she doesn't move. But you might feel something stir in your chest when you see her. You might remember a promise you didn't know you'd made. And if you stay long enough, you might hear the wind catch in the elm leaves and swear it almost sounds like a bell tolling. Only 3 times. Then silence.